We welcome to the show two very special guests. Kweku Mandela is a filmmaker and activist, a partner at Out of Africa Entertainment, his production company in South Africa, and the co-founder of Africa Rising, an organization devoted to changing Africa's image and fostering youth leadership. Kweku is the grandson of the late Nelson Mandela, who I believe to be the greatest figure of the 20th century. And later we'll be joined by photographer and filmmaker Lekha Singh. She is the producer and co-director of the documentary Beyond Right and Wrong, Stories of Justice and Forgiveness, which Kweku is helping to promote. First, let's talk about your grandfather. You watched the interview I did.
I did.
I've had lunch with him at his house. The same day I met with the man who freed him, which is incredible. And you're friends with that man, right?
I do know F.W. de Klerk. Yeah, I'm very fond of him.
Mr. de Klerk is a changed man, is he not?
He is, and he made a big, sacrifice, personal sacrifice in his life by taking such a bold move. It was a brave thing, and it just, goes to show the extraordinary men and women we had in our country.
All right, tell me about your grandfather and you.
Well, I mean, he was just like an ordinary grandfather to most of the grandchildren in the family. And for me, I remember he would avidly call me when I was at school and find out how I was doing. And then, he'd always invite us over for lunch. So, I had a typical relationship that any, I think, grandchild would have with their grandfather.
How many grandchildren did he have?
He had 18.
Wow. When he was in prison, how old were you?
When he was in prison, I was basically, I'd been born in 1985, and I was 4.5 when he was released from prison in 1990.
You couldn't visit him before that, could you?
We'd visited him once.
They allowed that, huh?
They did, while he was under house arrest at Victor Verster.
What was it like, though, to have that? You lived in South Africa, he lived in South Africa. When he was that great a force, I mean, he was president of the country, you grew up with that. What was it like?
At times it was overwhelming, for sure, to have people look at your grandfather in kind of such an esteemed light, and to see people crying when they met him, to see how, children reacted around him. He had this aura, this quality, which I think made him extremely personable to almost anyone he came into contact with. And it was just extraordinary to see how people reacted to him. But at the same time, you had to keep something for yourself. And I think as family members, we were lucky that our grandfather instilled the notion that we all have legacies that we come from. And ultimately, he had his ancestors who ultimately made him who he was. So,
who's your grandmother?
My grandmother is Evelyn Massa, so she's the first wife.
And your father is, or was?
My father is Isaac Kamwa, and my mother is Maki.
And were they very close to your granddad?
I think my father was. My mom was close to him, but obviously she didn't have a lot of time to spend with him when he was in prison. And so they had a kind of distant relationship, which I think he had with all of his children, as much as he tried to build.
He was too much of a giant, right? I mean,
yeah.
The country took him as their father.
Definitely.
Were you with him near the end?
I was, ultimately, and it was an extremely, kind of painful time, I think, for all of us in the family.
He lingered a long time, and we didn't hear anything of him. The president went over there. They didn't let him see him. What was his ending like?
It was peaceful, ultimately. He was at home. He was surrounded by his family, and he had a great group of people that had looked after him for most of, his kind of late life, who were all there. So
very sad. Even though he lived a long and incredible life, there was some loss.
There was a huge loss, particularly for our country, which I think for so long their identities revolved around him. But I think, something that I took to heart, a dear friend of mine sent me a message, saying, a great man hasn't passed into history. Ultimately, his legacy is just passed on to those that choose to follow it. And, I think South Africa as a whole is trying to live up to that.
You co-founded Africa Rising to spread a positive image of Africa. How does it work? What do you do?
So Africa Rising is an organization that we started because we traveled throughout the world and we met young people who just had a really kind of warped conception of what Africa was. And so we wanted to challenge that through showcasing youth development. And so our key focus has been on using arts and media ultimately to get out a message of what's actually going on amongst the youth on the continent. This year we're focusing on two big projects. One is the African Dream Campaign, which is us traveling around the continent asking young people, what is the African dream ultimately? And starting that conversation, because I think for a long time, Africans have known what the American dream is. They've known what the European dream is, but we haven't had a consistent message of what our own dreams are.
Wow, it's a noble cause. Does that keep you busy all the time?
Actually, film keeps me busy.
You're a filmmaker, right?
I am. So I produce films, ultimately. And recently we worked on a TV show called Someone Knows My Name, which focuses on one young woman's journey throughout slavery. We're currently working on a new project about Bram Fischer, who was the lead attorney in the Rivonia trial, and essentially stopped my grandfather from, getting the death penalty and ultimately getting him a life sentence.
Great man, too.
Yes.
That name you carry with you gets you entree, doesn't it?
To a certain degree it does.
Not a bad name to have.
Not a bad name at all. A lot of people have an attachment and affection for my granddad, and I've been lucky enough to have them share that with me.
As I've told you, I thought he was the greatest figure of the 20th century. I said that to him.
Thank you, Larry.
Our guest is Kweku Mandela, the great Nelson Mandela's grandson. After this break, filmmaker Lekha Singh will join us to discuss her documentary, Beyond Right and Wrong. Stay with us.
They asked me if I wanted to go to his trial. And I had no desire to do that at all. It doesn't give me, there's no punishment. Will that bring back David if I feel good about the fact that he's rotting in jail and his mother is sitting in Silwad without him? She's lost a child also in a way. So what joy could that bring me that he's sitting in jail? No. I didn't even get involved in that side of it at all. The memory for me is David sitting down there and going like this when he drove off. That's much more important for me. It's strange because when the army came to tell me that David had been killed, the first apparently thing I said is, you may not kill anybody in the name of my child.
We now welcome Lekha Singh, the producer and co-director of the award-winning documentary Beyond Right and Wrong, Stories of Justice and Forgiveness. And that was a clip from the film, and remaining with us, of course, is Kweku Mandela, who's got involved in this film. Tell me about this. What inspired you to make it?
Well, I was in Rwanda doing something else, and I saw that a woman who had lost 5 children, who had been killed during the genocide, was talking to this man who had killed her children. And I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I'm like, how is that even possible? Is that real? I mean, is this what human beings do? And were they really her children? So when I saw what was going on in Rwanda, the film is an exploration into whether that's possible, real, and I went from Rwanda to Israel and Palestine and Ireland too, because it's a universal thing.
Looking for
stories of people fighting for justice or forgiving and moving on, and what that entails.
In all cases, these prisoners or people who killed, they're all heroes?
No, they're not all heroes. It's just how two people, one person who's been wrong and the perpetrator, how is it possible for them to come together and forgive and move on?
A man interviewed in the film, I understand, says you have to tell your own story, but you also have to hear the story of the enemy. Mm-hmm. That's the classic forgiveness. Why is that important?
I think it's important because we stopped hearing, and we stop listening to the other, and we are in our own stew and are rotting there. So
Aren't things unforgivable, though?
they are, and it's a very personal thing. My film is not at all prescriptive. It's just my inquiry and wonder into how is this possible, and that it is possible, and how healing happens once horrific things have happened and the screams have died down and the blood has dried and all that.
Well, I salute you. Have you made films before?
No, this is my first film.
What were you doing?
I was doing all kinds of things.
Now, I understand that money goes to charity every time someone watches the film.
Yes.
How does that work?
We wanted a different kind of distribution for the film to begin with, and this is, of course, an experiment. So we've raised $500,000 to be given away, and we want to help the people on the ground who do all kinds of work toward peace. And so we decided that we would make something like a website happen, and it's called filmraise.com. And you can watch the shorter version of it. And every time you watch it, you can pick a nonprofit, and we send money to the nonprofit.
And what's the website?
Filmraise.com.
R-A?
R-A-I-S-E.
Filmraise.com.
Yes.
What do you make of, speaking of forgiveness and fighting, of what's going on in Gaza right now?
I'm terribly saddened by it, but it also happened that the parents want to forgive each other. It's like they are sending notes to each other saying that we sympathize with what's happening with your child. So it's really interesting that parents feel the same way no matter whose child it is.
The classic example of forgiveness was your grandfather.
I think in some aspects, definitely.
What was a greater forgiveness than 26 years of being imprisoned and inviting the guards to your inaugural?
No, I mean, it's a huge feat, and I think we find these little stories of overcoming conflict and ultimately overcoming what we think is the impossible throughout Lekha's film, and that's what drew me to it.
What did it teach you doing this film? What did you learn?
Well, when my daughter saw it and she said, "Mom, you can never be angry again," and of course that's not possible, but I feel like my anger is short-lived, and I know the possibility of finding peace no matter what's happened to you exists, and that is very inspiring to me.
You're trying to get to 1 million views, right?
Definitely.
So how close are we?
We're building.
We are around 15,000. We're building. We hope to get a lot of views soon.
You're doing a new documentary about your grandfather?
I am. It's basically a film that I filmed in 2009 with 18 of my cousins, where we asked my granddad questions we'd always wanted to ask him in our lives. And so
When are we going to see that?
we're hoping to finish at the end of this year, and hopefully it will come out at the beginning of next year.
How do you follow this up, Lekha? How do you
I don't know. I'm working on another film right now called God, Sex, and the Body. It's about my friend Gabrielle Roth, who is a movement teacher.
God, Sex, and the Body.
Yes.
You'll get to 1 million views in a day on that one. Okay, so as I understand it, the money goes to charity every time someone watches the film.
Yes. So every time somebody
50
watches the film, 50 cents is donated to a nonprofit.
Turning the other cheek.
Yes.
I salute you both. Thank you
you.
very much. Thanks to my guests, Kweku Mandela and Lekha Singh. You can watch Beyond Right and Wrong, Stories of Justice and Forgiveness at Filmraise, one word, filmraise.com/Beyond Right and Wrong. And remember, every view raises money for charity. You can find me on Twitter at King's Things. See you next time.